The Presidio has many powerful stories to tell, stories that are embedded in the landscape of this park. Stories that relate to collective triumphs and stories that tell of darker times and of more troubling times. And as a national park, sharing those stories with the American public is a really significant thing that we can do in the place and the spaces where those events unfolded.
During World War II, the Presidio of San Francisco was a military post that played a pivotal role in the incarceration of Japanese Americans. In 1942, Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt issued civilian exclusion orders from his office in Building 35 in the Presidio that implemented Executive Order 9066. These actions forced Japanese Americans from their homes along the West Coast and incarcerated them in concentration camps for the duration of the war on the pretext of military necessity. Japanese immigration to the U.S. began in the late 1800s, and by the 1930s, people of Japanese descent had become integrated into the fabric of America.
Foreigners, particularly from Asia, have not always been, welcome here. So despite the discrimination of, and living in sort of ethnic enclaves, Japanese Americans really felt they did belong. I mean, they raised their children here. They believed in the American ideals of freedom and liberty. They sent their kids to American school. Their kids pretty much were raised being American.
Well, America is a land of immigrants. So people like my grandparents, they built a business, they raised a family.
They thrived in the horticulture business. By 1940, they owned about 40% of the truck farming industry, bringing fresh produce to food stands, like you see at farmers markets today.
In 1939, World War II began, and on December 7, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the U.S. formally entered the conflict. The Presidio of San Francisco was the headquarters of the Western Defense Command. Beginning in 1942, Commanding General of the Western Defense Command, Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, issued 108 civilian exclusion orders from the Presidio, implementing President Franklin D. Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066. These orders led to the incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans, targeting Japanese Americans on the West Coast, citizens and non-citizens alike.
Now you have to understand that all due process of law was denied. The 4th and 14th Amendments were violated. No one was charged with a crime. No one had a day in court. No one had access to an attorney. And that's wrong.
So my great-grandparents came to the United States in the 20s, opened up some hotels in downtown Los Angeles. But then Pearl Harbor happens in 1942, and they were incarcerated along with my grandfather in Aurora, Arkansas. He ended up having a couple siblings born in the camps, actually, 2 sisters.
Japanese Americans forcibly removed from the West Coast would spend the next few years in far-flung concentration camps.
In the western deserts, in swamps in the south, where they were concentrated for the remainder of the war, behind barbed wire, guardhouses, and soldiers with guns.
In the days leading up to Pearl Harbor, the Presidio of San Francisco was also home to the Military Intelligence Service Language School. MISLS became the first Army language school in the United States and was housed in Building 640 along Crissy Field.
One of the ironies of the Presidio's role in the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans is that less than a mile away from where Lieutenant General DeWitt is signing the civilian exclusion orders. The Army here at the Presidio was running a military intelligence language school, training Japanese Americans in the Japanese language to act as part of the war effort.
So a total of 60 students started right here at the Presidio of San Francisco under the eyes of General DeWitt.
After Pearl Harbor and Executive Order 9066, the MISLS was forced to move out of the Presidio and was relocated in Minnesota in 1942. But these soldiers made an impact. They turned out to be America's secret weapon during the war, saving lives and helping to shorten the war by 2 years. When the war ended, tens of thousands of Japanese Americans were released and allowed to return home.
You know, after the war, in New York and other places throughout the country, people were erupting in groups of joy and that the war was over, ticker tape parades, etc. But for Japanese Americans, it was a whole other story.
They felt ashamed. They just wanted to get on with their lives. They wanted to prove that they were good Americans by rebuilding businesses and raising their families and being part of the community in general.
40 years after the war ended, the federal government unequivocally stated that race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership had motivated this mass incarceration, not military necessity. In 1994, the Presidio became a public park site after 218 continuous years of military use. Today, the park welcomes guests from around the world and is the proud home of both the Military Intelligence Service Historic Learning Center and the Fred T. Korematsu Institute. Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt's office stands empty in what is now the Bay School of San Francisco.
And that's the uniqueness of the Presidio. You have a nexus of war and peace all together, and the stories that emanate from here. Lessons learned from World War II happen right here, and it's right under our noses, and we need to dig deep and discover, for ourselves the truth and reality that goes on.
The irony of being a Japanese American student and going to high school in the same building where they signed all of the executive orders incarcerating Japanese Americans is not lost on me. I think it's an integral part of both American history and Presidio history, definitely.
If people could take a minute to try to put themselves in that place, that the Japanese and Japanese Americans had to endure during that time, what kind of decision would they make? Would they want their civil rights stripped from them just because they look like the enemy? What would they do?